Praise be to God, Lord of the universes, before whose oneness there is no before, unless the before is He, and after whose singularity there is no after, unless the after is He. He was, and there was not with Him any before, nor after, nor above, nor below, nor closeness, nor distance, nor how, nor where, nor when, nor time, nor moment, nor period, nor duration, nor manifested existence, nor place. And He is now as He was.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight and sharing the space here in my home for our Ismael-Isaac program. I'd like to introduce to you our guest speaker tonight. His name is Professor Zaman Stanizai, and he's an eloquent and knowledgeable Muslim speaker and lecturer, but from the context of more of a progressive and inclusive, which is the kind of Islam that NPV advocates for. So I've known Zaman for several years. So this is the second time he's speaking at our community. So I'm really glad to have him share his knowledge with you tonight.
We decided upon sharing our views about God, and so I'm going to speak for a few minutes, 10 or 15, and then Zaman is going to speak, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. Okay. So I'd like to pass this around. I find it easier for the group, especially when we're doing things in a speedy nature, to put some stuff down on paper. If we were fundamentalist Jews, our discussion about God would be very simple. One God, and only one view of that God. Since we're not Orthodox Jews, we have a number of other avenues of belief. So, thought we'd share a little bit of this. Okay. You want a chair?
I'm going to be moving around.
Yeah. So, I'll kind of talk through it, and you can sort of follow me a little bit on this. When one talks about what Jews think about God, you got to remember one thing, that being a Jew does not necessarily mean you're a religious Jew. Okay? I know that the notion of a non-religious Muslim usually then classifies you as a non-Muslim. Okay? I think perhaps in a number of decades there'll be Muslims for Progressive Values will provide Muslims with other kinds of religious options that mainstream Islam does not provide now. Just as mainstream Orthodox Judaism doesn't provide options, whether it's for the different ways of talking about God, or whether it's LGBT rights, whether it's the role of women in the movement. If you come to visit a Reformed synagogue like ours, you'll see even women presidents of the congregation. Okay, get two of them sitting right here. Sharon was a president, and Barbara is going to be president of our temple. You won't see that obviously in an Orthodox setting. So when one talks about God, it'll do this. I've got to keep moving here. You think about the name of the Jewish people, and in Hebrew it's Israelite or Yisrael. Have you ever heard the word Yisrael? It doesn't always refer to the state of Israel, Midinat Yisrael. It refers to Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. And how do we get that name? We got that name because it says in Genesis 32:10, and Jacob was left alone. He wrestled with a man. He woke up from his wrestling match, and he was beating the man. He was holding him down. And the man said, "Let me go, let me go." And Jacob said, "No, not till you bless me." And so he blesses him with this blessing: "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but your new name shall be Israel. For you have wrestled with God and with men, and you have prevailed." That sentence alone requires an hour and a half of study. Okay? Just that one sentence. But it's the source of the name Israelite or Yisrael, and it means one who Yisra wrestles with El, God. And in a simple word, that describes the relationship that Reformed Jews or Jews in general have with God. It's an interaction. It's a wrestling match, so to speak. It's not totally submissive and passive. We enter into a relationship with God, and you'll see how that plays out. So Yisrael, the name of the Jewish people, means those who wrestle, or I think an even better word, even though the actual word is wrestling, it's engaging God. It's engaging and entering into a give and take relationship with God. So if we were fundamentalist Jews, our God talk would have only one option, and that is a God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-present. That would be called the theistic God, and as a religious Jew, I can believe in a theistic God, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present. Okay? That I'm assuming we would agree too that the Quran presents that same notion of God, but that's not my subject. But the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present God is one of those options. But since we're not fundamentalist Jews, but we have the freedom to think about God, to imagine God in a way that we wish, and we'll get to the details of that because it's not totally carefree. There are other kinds of views of God. Again, you still got to remember, it's one God, but different views of God, which allows a Jew to say, there's one God, but a Muslim can have a view, a Catholic can have a view, a Buddhist can have a view. There can also be an atheist over here who has no view, and that would be atheism. But there's finite theism, which is a God concept that Jews can believe in, religious Jews, and that is to say, a God that does know everything, and is very present, but a God that is not all-powerful, which tends to be people's bigger problem with God, as happened today. Our hearts go out to all the families in Santa Barbara, and people will say, besides the NRA and besides the politicians, as one of the fathers said today, that there are things that happen in life that we just don't have an answer for or can't control. And if you believe in a God who is all-powerful, God can control that, and you turn to that God. And you can either raise a finger, get angry, say what you want, but it becomes God's responsibility. But if you choose not to do that, there are many people who will say, I don't believe in God anymore. This tragedy happened in my life, and I don't believe in God anymore. As a Reformed Jew, I can turn to that person and say, well, you don't believe in, you're not a theistic person. You don't relate to God as an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present God, because you have a problem with the all-powerful part. You don't believe in a God that can actually enter into history and change what's going on in life right here. God couldn't stop that murderer today and taken the gun out of his hands and stop him from killing. God couldn't do that. And so it doesn't mean you have to leave God. One of the nice things about being a progressive Jew is I can offer different God ideas to somebody so that that God idea fits where they're at in their life. Again, it's still the one God, but it's a view of God that is different. You could be a naturalist and say there is no God at all beyond nature. There is no God at all beyond nature. Okay? And there are different Jewish philosophers that we could study and present that view. You could be a humanist and say that there is no God outside of me or in nature. There's only a God within me. That would be a Jewish religious humanist. And again, I mentioned atheism or agnosticism. That could be an approach. People will say, can you be a religious Jew and be an atheist? And in our progressive movement, the answer is yes. I'm not going to go around the room and ask people, are you an atheist? Are you an agnostic? Okay? But I guarantee you amongst Muslims and amongst Jews, there are plenty of people who identify as Muslims and identify as Jews, some even as religious Jews, but say, I'm not sure about God, I'm not sure what to believe about God, I wrestle with it, I change, I grow, I decide this is what I believe and then I don't believe it anymore. and I have trouble holding on to my God belief. As a progressive Jew, our religious Jews have that opportunity to be flexible and to allow their God concept to change and grow as they live their lives. All of these options apply kind of a free will. We teach that, you know the story of Adam in the Garden of Eden, when Adam reached out for the apple. It wasn't really an apple. We're not sure what fruit it was. But he reached out for that fruit and ate for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What he was reaching for was free will. Adam and Eve ultimately decided that they wanted to live their lives out from under God's thumb in the garden, but wanted to live their lives in this world. So, though the church considers that an ultimate sin, the original sin, we consider that the ultimate grab for freedom and for free will. You can see the way God evolves in the Bible when you look at the God of the Noah story as a God who is an absolute monarch, a God who just says, I'll do what I do without answering to anybody. And so he brings this flood. And of course Noah doesn't say anything to God about it, but he brings the flood. And then after the flood is over, what does God do? Apologizes. Says, oh, I did the wrong thing. Not explicitly, but I promise I'll never bring another flood again. And God changes or grows or matures, so to speak. We can argue about whether it's God maturing or our view of God maturing, but God becomes a God who is not perfect and isn't absolute, but actually is a limited monarch. Says, I'll never bring another flood again. And eventually, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God also becomes a reasonable God that we can talk with. We, as human beings, have the ability and the power and are encouraged in Judaism to challenge God. And so in Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 18, Abraham gets God to think, at least, are you doing the right thing? You sure? And there's also other times too where Moses gets angry. And God gets angry and says, I'm going to wipe out the Israelites. They're worshiping a golden calf. And Moses tells God to take some time out. Cool off. Cool off. Go cool off. Think twice about it. How many times have we all said that to ourselves? Okay? And so God does. And God changes God's mind and says, okay. So all of a sudden we have a God who doesn't have absolute power. We have a God who realizes that. We have a God who can actually regret doing something. And we have a God who's reasonable and approachable. Till eventually we get to Mount Sinai, and we have a God who actually enters into a deal with us. A covenant, a contract. And the covenant is, if we follow the mitzvot, if we follow Judaism and keep it alive, I'll take care of you. I'll make sure you're still alive. And so we're still here. We don't do everything we maybe God wanted us to do in the first place, but we are still here. But you see the evolution in the Torah and how God can change or our perceptions of God can change. So you see, you're getting a picture, a complex picture of our wrestling with God. When you've got two entities, me and God, and both of us change and grow and respond to life, you've got a complex relationship. And being a progressive Jew and not a fundamentalist Jew who believes only in theism, it gives me that opportunity to relate to God in that way. Number 3 on the back page, it's just a part, again, another example of the lack of clarity about who God is and what God is. And that is when Moses says, you wanted me to go to talk to Pharaoh and talk to the people, and who shall I say shall send me? Should I say it's, and God says, tell him I am that I am sent you. And I am that I am doesn't say anything. And the same thing applies to a moment when Moses really says, you really want me to go down to Egypt? You really want me to do this? And for what? I couldn't even see you. You're talking through a bush there and I can't understand. Who are you? And he says, and God says, by my real name, I haven't told you. But by other names, like Elohim and Adonai, all my other names, I have let you been able to talk to me. But My real name, I can't know. It makes sense. If we knew God's real name, then we'd know God's real address. And then we could find God and Google God. Okay? But if I Googled God's real name, it wouldn't come up. I'm not sure you ever remember seeing the movie Oh God, where George Burns kept on saying, I want to see you, I want to see you. He says, you can't see me. If you saw me, you wouldn't be alive. Okay? So you can't, again, in Jewish tradition, we don't know the real name of God. On number 4, the working definition that I like to work with is that blank is the source for the important, unanswerable questions I have about life and living. Blank is the source for the important. And the important word in the sentence is important, because a question that you have about your life that was important to you when you were 5 years old, or important to the cavemen 25,000 years ago, or 500,000 years ago. When they came out of the caves, they looked around and said, oh, why did the sun go down? Okay? They're scared. They didn't know what was going on. That's an unanswerable question. Nowadays, you just go ask a scientist. Okay? So blank is the source for the important, unanswerable questions I have about my life. You could fill in the blank. God's name, as it says in the Torah, is YHWH, sometimes pronounced Yahweh. Okay? Jehovah Witnesses pronounce it Jehovah or Yehovah, but that's not really a correct pronunciation. It's really 4 letters put together that are unpronounceable in English. If I were to try to pronounce it, it would sound a little bit like this. You can't do it. You can't do it. Given the consonants and the vowels, you cannot a human voice cannot say the word with the yud, hey, those 4 unpronounceable letters. Okay? So you can fill it in with the force. You can use the name Allah. We use Adonai. And I put it as a little humor. X27YG. See it there? Now, that's God's real name. If anyone can pronounce that, okay, you can't do it. You can't do it. Now, how do you fill in the blank? And this is the important thing, and this is what limits. You know, we're not free to just think about God any way we want. It's got to follow certain basic criteria, and these are all taken from Talmud or Jewish tradition. 1, you can fill in the blank with anything you want as a source for the important and unanswerable questions you have, but as long as that God, or whatever that is you filled it up with, is incorporeal, has no physical form. Do anything you want. Call it the wellspring of life, but no physical form. The second thing it's God that promotes a unity. Okay? Shema Yisrael promotes a unity. One God and a unity of human beings. If it promotes disunity, it can't be a Jewish God concept. For any Jew, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative. And the last, that if it is a God who commands you, because if you're a humanist, you don't believe in anything that commands you at all, outside of you. If you're a naturalist, you find God out in nature. Okay? But if it's a God that talks to you and commands you, tells you what you should do, that's fine, as long as the command that God gives is a command that's in line with what the Torah teaches. So there can never be a Jewish command to go kill somebody else, to go murder somebody else. You can kill in self-defense. But it would be contrary to, if it's a God who says to me, God told me I should murder. Okay, that would not be a Jewish God concept. So in conclusion, we believe in one God, but we believe also that every human being has an image of that God. And as long as it falls into these criteria, it can be a valid Jewish God concept in a progressive Jewish setting. Okay? Would any of these God concepts be accepted in a fundamentalist Jewish setting? No. So they wouldn't be teaching Buber and Kaplan and some of these Jewish philosophers who promote these things. Okay? They may teach them for fun, but they would, but a more fundamentalist setting wouldn't do that. So one God with many images, all leading to the freedom of every human being, especially progressive Jews, to relate to God in that way. Therefore, what happens is that the covenant becomes more of an engagement than a wrestling match, and it becomes what I like to call a team effort. So when one studies theology as a Reformed progressive Jew, it's work to do that. It's not simple, and it's very complex. But it's rewarding if you take the time to do it. Oh, okay. I'll turn it
This
on.
lecture. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, in the name of God, the most gracious and most merciful. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahmanir Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim, غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
I thank the oneness of being for being and for letting me be. And I thank you all for being here. The reflections I have on the opening chapter of the Quran are not to be confused with a translation. In the name of the paracosmic consciousness, whose love radiates through our soul, and whose glory graces every grain of our being. All praise is due to the infinite eternity, whose divine awe defines our fragile illusions, whose oneness of being permeates the multiplicity of perpetually unfolding multiverses, the wholeness of immeasurable timeless tomorrows, whose essence is woven through every fiber of our being. O Divine Beloved, the ineffable shaper of transient temporalities and transcendent realities, give us the thought that thinks Thee, a pleading heart that desires Thee, a yearning that utters nothing but Your love. Turn us into a longing that dies to dissolve in the harmonic convergence of Your totality. Guide us to thread our pathways through the splendor of Your enchanting mystical gardens, and idyllic lush meadows where moments of Your manifest beauty attain a foreverness all their own. Distance us from the dissonance of dark energy. Bathe us in the luminous glow of Your countenance, light upon light upon light. When we speak of God from a more modernistic perspective, I believe that the word is obsolete, the concept is obsolete, and in many cases the way we perceive God is pretty irrelevant. We become godly out of a necessity where the vacuum that's in our heart needs to be filled, but we don't know how, and we don't know what to fill it with. So we come up with a perception, with a projection that is nothing more but our own projection, the self, the ego, that we superimpose about some notion. And the problem with the notion is that the notion of God that most of us operate within is a God that is thousands of years old. It's a God of a tribal human being, of an ancient culture that has pretty much no relevance to our lives today. And while it had evolved through the axial age, and then later on through the prophetic age, it had staled at some point. So while in terms of science and technology, we have covered a lot of ground. We have pretty much conquered nature, and nations too, of course. and we have conquered space. We have made many advancements in science and in technology, but in terms of an understanding and a proper understanding of God, we are stuck way back, centuries back. And when we hear philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who said God is dead, perhaps he's right. But we have to know which God is that has died. And the God that is dead is that tribal God. The God of vengeance, anger, retribution. The God that is easily employable for our own angers to attack the other, to kill all the murder and mayhem that is inflicted upon hundreds of thousands of people, not in the past, even right now. That is not God. That is a historically stuck perception that we simply take from the personal level, psychologically, to the level of collective psyche, which then manifested at the national level, at a certain cultural level, and we call God into any misdeed we want to do. Just imagine back in 1991, when we had Billy Graham and George Bush huddling in the White House, praying to God that this war that they were going to launch in the Middle East, asking that God for a victory. And over on the other side, Saddam Hussein, among other things, the socialist denier of God, all of a sudden discovered one. And he went to his bunkers and called for his God to give him victory against the God of Bush and Billy Graham. One God? I don't think so. The true God? I don't think so. It's simply the human ego that manifests at the cultural level, at the service of the militarists. And when people are saying that religion is the cause of all the problems, it's not religion. We have abandoned religion too. So in modern times, when you look at it, that most of people who have some level of religiosity, their complaint is that, oh, it's the age of secularism. I think it's not only the age of secularism that is devoid of God. The greater problem is that our religiosity is devoid of even greater God. I think the God of the secularist has not caused much problem. They don't claim it. The communists killed by the millions, the fascists killed by the millions, but again, they were not making a claim. But then those of us who claimed a God and who used that God to annihilate 86% of the entire population of the Western Hemisphere, find out what God that is. And of course, I won't go to the modern, to many cases that we all know about. So I think what we need is that while we have made advancements in science and technology, we have to work on the God side of it. And the way we can understand God is, number one, God has to be freed. The concept has to be freed. The concept of God right now is in the chains of our own imagination, whatever we perceive of God. We have to free it of that. Number one, God has to be de-anthropomorphized. Excuse the Greek here. That we have the habit as humans that anytime we want to give things a form, a shape in our imagination, what shape do we give it? Our own. When people see images of Jesus or Mary in marble stones and things like that, it's because somehow they think that it has to look like a human, and which human? It's themselves. And so, if God is God, it cannot be human. And if it cannot be human, it has no need to look like human. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have to get rid of our audacity, of our arrogance, especially of our scientific community, who act as though we are smart enough to know everything there is. And if we don't know it today, we will know it tomorrow. But we know. We never question that our capacity to know everything is limited. There are certain things we know. There are certain things we can know. But there are few people who admit that there are certain things for which we do not have the capacity to know. The things we make, like computers, artificial intelligence, we know the limitation of our computers. It has only such an amount of memory and this and that. Of that we are aware of the limitations, but we never admit of our own. And so therefore, you never ask, there isn't anyone who would admit that we simply may not have the ability to know God. And let me take you to the 13th century Muslim world. At the height of the Muslim world as a civilizational force, not as a cultural religion, that's a separate issue. There were two strands of thought in terms of what God is. One was represented by certain Sufis, the spiritually inebriated one. One of their teachers was called Sheikh Bastami. And he was so much in love with God that from his perspective, the perception of the divine beloved, the attributes of the divine beloved could equally be applied and invoked upon a human being. So he would say things such as, Fasubhani, glory be to me, which is obviously blasphemous from a Muslim context. But he was able to get away with it because he was saying that the God is within. And the traditional view can be expressed more in the Prophet Muhammad's favorite prayer, which was Subhanaka ma arafnaka. It's a prayer, but it's a pleading and it's an asking for forgiveness. It's a supplication. The words of the forgiveness are not in there, but they are implied. And it would roughly translate as follows. Glory be to you, O God, for we have not been able to know you as you deserve to be known. This question came up in an encounter between two geniuses of the 13th century. One was Rumi, I'm sure most of you have heard of him, and his mentor Shams. And what created the spiritual bonding between these two was that when Shams came and said, answer me this question. So he said, what's the question? He said, if the Prophet of God said, we have not been able to know you as you deserve to be known, who is this other man who comes and says, I know God so well that I feel comfortable even using his attributes to myself? So which one is right and who is higher in rank? And Rumi said that Bayezid, the Sufi, was a man who did not have the capacity greater than getting drunk with one cup. But Muhammad was an ocean drinker. He knew a lot more, but the more he knew, the more he knew that he did not know the one he wanted to know. And so being aware of that reality, which was beyond his capacity, he always asked for that forgiveness. Is that this is my perception of you, O God. This is how I know you. But I know that you deserve better, to be known in better terms than the way I can know you. And so I think it's incumbent upon us human beings, regardless of creed, religion, cultural identity, whatever, is that we match our progress in sciences with our understanding of God. And so if we can follow that evolutionary curve, where the tribal God, the cultural God, the God of the organized religion, eventually got to that point back in the 13th century, 14th century, is that to start from that point and not follow the decline and build upon what was built then. And in that understanding, from a spiritual Sufi Islamic perspective, God is to be understood in two ways. One God, two strands of thought. God is both transcendent and immanent. So as a metaphysical reality, beyond the reach of human rationality, beyond our ability even to think that we can know. Not that we know, that we can know, to admit that. That God has to be acknowledged, that there is a God. And that is not conditioned upon us knowing it. So, we are not the criteria, because our senses are very limited. The mere fact that we have created telescopes and microscopes, simple glasses, shows that we do have senses, but these senses have limitations. So what right do we have to say that if there is God, then we must be able to see it? Knowing that an eagle can see 40 times better than us and can focus on a grain of corn 40 miles away. We humans can't. Knowing that a cat's sense of smell is 400 times higher than ours. And we can go on and on. There are many other animals who excel in the same senses that we have. And yet, our ego would not allow us to admit that, but say that we humans are the standard of reality. If we don't see it, it doesn't exist. If we can't hear it, then it doesn't exist. So, going beyond that then, we have to understand that there is God, the transcendent one. Now, the second aspect is the immanent God. And the immanent God is in your heart. Not just close. That's one thing. But it's close in the heart, and heart means feelings, emotions, and senses. And these both, the transcendent God and the immanent God, are one. So the immanent God is perceived by Muslims not just out of formality as the divine beloved. When you look at the Sufi poetry, if you didn't know who it was written for, you will have no doubt but saying that this is love poetry. Why is Rumi the poet of love? Because both the object and the subject of love is divine. It's not a human being. And so we can't be distanced from God. The Quran says God is both fil afaq wal anfus. That it's within the frame of the farthest horizon of your imagination. As far back as you can go. So beyond certain land and mountain, beyond the earth, beyond the solar system, beyond the clusters, beyond the galaxies, beyond the universe. And in Islam there's no universe, there are multiverses. So beyond all the verses, both poetic and stratospherical, God is still there, beyond that. That's the transcendent. And then the other one is fil anfus, which is within you. So within the core of your very essence, there is a God. In other words, you, whatever height, weight you are no standard for measuring any distance. It's a continuum on both ends. Think big, there's bigger than the big you think. Think small, there's smaller than the small you think. That's an infinity. And God fills this entire infinity. And so when part of that infinity is inside of you, that is the God within. And so we have to connect the two. Understand God rationally through our mind, feel God through our love in our heart, and then we can build upon a God that is probably the right one for our time and our age. So we wouldn't be thinking of God as something that people run away from, but not a thing, not an entity. Because God does not have a shape, and we should not give it a shape. It does not have a form. We should not give it a form. It doesn't have an image. It doesn't have a name. The word Allah in Islam means the nothingness. Anything you can imagine, God is other than that. So let me conclude by two verses from Rumi's magnum opus, the spiritual couplets. O برادر تو همان اندیشه‌ای ما بقی تو استخوان و ریشه‌ای هرچه اندیشی پذیرای فناست آن که در اندیشه ناید آن خداست. O brother and sister, you are a deep sense of thought. Other than that, you are a mere flesh and bone. Anything you can conceive rationally and perceive through your imagination is destined to demise and disappear. That which is other than that is God. Thank you.
Rabbi, just something I learned, the origin of the word God for Jewish people, Israel, you said from the one who wrestled with God. It comes from the same root where the Arabic word Yisra is, which means wrestle too. Mm-hmm. That's another common word I just learned today in Fort having come.
Yep.
Yes,
when Zaman said that Allah means nothing, the nothing?
The nothingness. So I translate it as al-law. So al is the article, the definite article, the. And law means nothing. And so when you put the two together, I think in some way it's similar to the Jewish concept of the Yahweh, which is, again, by the way, those four letters are neither vowels nor consonants, phonologically speaking. They are called glides. And so the unpronounceability of it is scientific.
So, as the word la is low in Hebrew, which means no or negative.
I was struck by the mystical nature of much of your presentation, and I was fascinated by the way you were able to balance the rational, let's say the transcendent and immanent and so forth, and put them all together. And I really appreciated your referring to the two different approaches in the 13th century. I always wondered who Rumi was, because I see him on greeting cards and so forth. And when you said that Allah means the nothingness, it reminded me of the mystical concept in Judaism of Ein Sof, which is very deep and hard to understand, which is kind of like the opposite. It means something like there is no end. Is that correct?
Yeah, there is.
Not an end. So, because I'm trying to put it all together, because I really resonate with the mystical and the more rational.
What Barbara is referring to is that when we study Bible, as you would study Quran, you would study the text, but also you'd study some of the commentaries and what the scholars have written about it. So when we study Bible, we study first the simple translation of what the actual words mean, and then we go to a broader explanation of what that sentence may mean, and then eventually you get to what's called the hint, a little hint of something that's transcended perhaps, and then finally you get to the sod, the esof, the ending, or the bottom, so to speak. You reach the deepest understanding of the text. And in our tradition, that's what we do. We look at the text, the simple text, and work until we find what the deepest meaning is. Depending upon what level of Jew you are religiously and spiritually, depends upon how far you want to dig. So some people dig this far, some people dig this far.
I have a question. In your, Rabbi Jim, in your presentation, you had these 5 different categories of the way people perceive God. Theism, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present. The second was the Finite Theism, all-knowing, all-present, but not all-powerful. The third is naturalism, God in nature only. I relate a lot to that. And fourth one is
You
humanism.
love Martin Buber. Go ahead, yeah.
Humanism, within each of us only. I relate to that too. And the fifth one, atheism and agnosticism. I relate to a little bit of the agnostic part as well. And so I feel like it's not even a clear, for myself personally, it's not a clear break from one perception of the Creator. Right? It's a little bit of everything.
You like salsa?
Yeah.
Well, you need an F. All of the above.
All of the above.
Well, it is, I mean,
All
the
of the above.
theistic ones, so Zaman was referring to the tribal, that really is theism.
Yeah.
The all-powerful, all-knowing, present
Yeah.
God, you intone, and,
Yeah.
you know, the God, the Bob Dylan, the God is my side, you know,
Yeah,
this
that's
kind
right.
of thing. So,
But it's interesting, but combining the two talks, and then when Zaman said it was a tribal perception of God, and then that totally makes sense.
Mhm.
How, in the way the Muslim community, the traditional community, looks at God in a very male-dominated tribal patriarchy structure, that totally clicks. And I think the progressive critical analysis of sacred texts and the discussions that we have is all of the above, the F, including agnostics. So it's interesting.
I mean, you know, all fundamentalism by definition, I think, is patriarchal and tribal. But, you know, I think there are safe and healthy fundamentalists, and then there are unsafe and unhealthy fundamentalists. And the unhealthy ones who, you know, convene in the White House or in, you know, Baghdad and beg that their God allows them to ride to victory.
If I want to address the issue that Barbara raised was that the Western world, Europe primarily, has had trouble, at least for the last 2,500 years, if not longer, of trying to balance the mind and the heart. So when one takes over, the other one is subjected and eliminated and forced out of the political stage. And so when there was an age in Greek thought when the mythos and the logos were struggling, and at one point the logos, which is the logic, the reason, they won and the mythos lost, and so those gods were kind of relegated to the back burner of history, and so reason took over. Then subsequently in the Christian world it was the same thing. So it was either a Christian state, or it was a totally anti-Christian state. So for 300 years, Christians were persecuted because they were not allowed, because the power of reason was still there. And then when Christians came as a state, as an empire, as a Roman Empire, under Christian name, then faith came and reason went out for another 500 or so years. Then came the age of quote-unquote enlightenment. So then reason comes back and faith goes out. Now, this is a European cultural characteristics in the historical context. Other cultures have been able to balance the two. So in the Muslim culture, they have always had both. And that's why many Europeans, when they try to analyze the Muslim culture, it's like, in the 20th century, why are they so fanatically religious? Because they think it's the age of rationalism, then in the age of rationalism you cannot be religious because that's a matter of heart. Whereas for the Muslims, says, no, we can be both. There is no problem. So I think the age of enlightenment was a great disaster. It was good for rationalism to get on the stage, but it was not good for the mind to come on the stage was okay, but to push the heart out, that was the wrong part of it. So the Western culture has been like a bird that flies with one wing. Whether it's the right one or the wrong, it doesn't matter. It's always missing something. And so if we can somehow balance that it doesn't have to be an either or, but both and. And in that case, this struggle, remember even from the time of Jesus, give to the Caesar and the church and state struggle. That has persisted to this day. But that's because it's a European thinking. So but if we somehow can cross this boundary, this block, this psychological block in the Western mindset, is that yes, there is another world on the other, equally valid. Now remember why we call this Western democracy, and where does it take its roots? That rationalism of the Greeks is connected with this rationalism of Enlightenment, and the rest of it is irrelevant, not valid. And so that's why the cultural riches are just thrown out the window. And what they do is that they take this mindset, this what do you call it, single track mind, and they want to impose it on the rest of the world, invalidate religious communities around the world, that because they say, if we couldn't live with both, then why should you be able to? Because it's an anomaly. European thinking is anomaly.
In Jewish tradition, in Jewish history, when we've had the rabbis or the leaders become too fanatical, too fundamentalistic, caring only about the law and not the love, there was rebellion. And we rebelled. Jesus rebelled against the rabbis of the ancient temple because the ancient rabbis of the temple cared only about the offering that you brought and not about their souls. And it's one of the main reasons he wanted to rebel. In the 6th century, it was called the Karaite Rebellion, who rebelled against the rabbis who interpreted all the traditions and piled up tradition upon tradition upon tradition, and had to do this, you had to do this, you had to separate milk and meat, you had to do all these things. And finally, the people rebelled and said, no, the Torah only says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. It doesn't say I have to separate cheese and milk, cheese and meat. Okay? It only says this. And so the Karaites rebelled. It affected the rabbis. They changed a lot of their rulings. In the 16th century, the rabbis again and the leaders became too fundamentalist, too overly concerned about the details of the law and holding to the strict ritual, male-dominated, of course. And who brought rebellion? Hasidim, the Hasids. The Hasidic movement rebelled against that, and they softened Judaism, doing the same kinds of things, attempting to balance out issues of the mind and issues of the heart. So NPV is that too. NPV will be and should be one of those balancing forces, rebellious forces.
I wanted Zaman to give an example of, we were talking the other night, last time we saw each other, and we talked about that scientists, and you were saying, yeah, the scientists in the Muslim world, they were both scientists and poets. Who was not a poet during this? Can you just elaborate on that? Because that was...
Well, because education
was
was, for two reasons. It was more holistic. One, because it was, I mean, the field of sciences were limited. And the other thing was that if you had to graduate from a school, there was no dichotomy of separation. Again, the either-or didn't exist. So you had to learn, for instance, Avicenna is a poet. He's a medical doctor. He wrote the Qanun, the canons of medical science that were kind of the Bible of the medical world for centuries, until the middle of the 19th century. And then he was the great philosopher who was able to combine Greek philosophy, reason, and mix it with revelation that eventually went to Averroes or Ibn Rushd in Spain, and then came to Maimonides, and then it came to Thomas Aquinas, and then finally Europeans thought, oh, wait a minute, so if those Muslims can put the two together, what's wrong with us? And it took them another 300 years once they got the recipe that, oh yeah, they can do it. So the sciences were not compartmentalized. But I think that as far as the three dominant religions that we all talk about, in my view, they're all, it's a story of three rebels. Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, they all rebelled. One against Pharaoh's, aristocracy, plutocracy. The other one against the Roman state. And the other one against the Quraysh state. So they were all rebels. Now, if you think that all these religions were founded in rebellious not in the sense of being not legitimate, because usually by definition when you call someone a rebel, is that you consider the state to be legitimate. So reaction to it is illegitimate. Not in that sense. Rebel in the sense that the demands of the rebelling party are as legitimate as the claims of the establishment. And so in that sense, all three of them offer that. And so I think where we stand in this juncture of history is, as the Quran says, which some of you might be surprised, is that when Moses went to Mount Sinai, God told him, and I'm quoting from the Quran, that there was a stage of transformation, which in Quranic language is called khal'in na'alayn, the taking off of the sandals. So leave your sandals there, you're on this holy ground. And we have to elevate ourselves there, and each one of us has to become a Moses. And what made Moses Moses, now I'm preaching to you. What made Moses Moses from my perspective was that he was tested both through fire and through ice. And again, some of these may not be biblical, they might be Quranic, that when he was a child, he was tested because the Pharaoh became suspicious that he was trying to reach for the beads in his beard. And the Pharaoh said, they were predicting that the person who's going to destroy me will be born. This child is of that same age. And so they brought a test to see if he was doing it deliberately or if he was only a child. And so they put a flame of fire on one side and a shining red stone on the other. And when Moses was trying to reach for the stone, as the obvious thing, Gabriel was sent by God. He hit Moses' hand to touch the fire, and it got burned. Touched his tongue, and his tongue burned, and he was stuttered for the rest of his life. That was his test of fire. And of course the test of water was, he was from the water.